Like you, I have seen on news feeds the tragic, sadly iconic still shot of Mr. George Floyd pinned mercilessly to the ground under the full weight of the white police officer who glowered at those who recorded him. I saw the picture, but I must confess that that is all that I've seen. I can't push play. I can't watch another white man in uniform heartlessly slaughter another defenseless black human as he pleads for his life. I can't push play, not simply because of my own emotional fragility, but because as emotionally disturbing as Mr. Floyd's murder is, it needs to be seen to traumatize every thinking and feeling individual so that it moves us beyond complacency and toward constructive action. The reason I can't push play is because I fear what it will unleash in me. As a reasonable person, I know that rage and the desire for revenge are rational responses to the murder of an innocent life. To quote an African proverb, the axe forgets, but the tree remembers. And I will not for a second shrink from this remembrance, for that would not be a rational response. I am a man, and therefore I assert my right of existence, my right to liberty, and my right to self-actualization. For this is what I am made to be and what I'm made to do. This legitimate desire will not abate until there is an equitable redress meted out against this sworn officer, his complicit colleagues, and the regime that empowered them to act with such impunity. This is the sentiment that fills streets in cities across America, even at this very hour, with people of all colors, of good conscience, who are asserting their claim to liberty and justice for all. They are living out what James Baldwin asserted when he said, "Freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be." Let me be clear. I condemn in the strongest terms possible the acts of destruction and violence against property and people perpetrated by a minority of protesters, amongst the many thousands of whom have exercised their constitutional right of freedom of expression. With the same breath, I associate myself with equal might to the sentiment that motivated the untoward behavior of the few, because it differs only in praxis from the many. If Martin Luther King was right, that riot is the language of the unheard, then it is vital that America does not invite further its rampage by being distracted by the method of riot and miss its message. We know that America has the ability to separate the method from the message, as we just witnessed days ago. American state capitals overrun and captured by thugs, armed to the teeth with automatic weapons. These insurrectionists were simply permitted to threaten the government itself without the mustering of military to enforce law and order. Meanwhile, the commander-in-chief, the one who swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States from enemies, foreign and domestic, tweeted his endorsement of their sedition. If their message about reopening was heard without affirming their means, then this same practice is needed in this instance so that we can hear the cries of anguish and see the tears of torment of those of us who continue to suffer from unjust pain that has lingered for far too long and has gone unseen and unheard. While I assert my rights as a man, I am more. I am a Christian and a Christian minister, which means that I cannot simply be motivated by my convictions or informed by historic figures and quotations. Ultimately, I am not my own. I must defer my feelings to those preached and prescribed by Jesus, who is not simply my Savior, but is also my Lord. And so in times of crisis, outrage, and pain, I am obligated to ask this question. WWJD, what would Jesus do? Please do not dismiss this question as being too sophomoric or shallow, because of its almost commercial application. Actually, it dates back to 1886 from a series of sermons by a congregational minister named Charles Sheldon, entitled In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? In each sermon, he would present an issue of moral dilemma and then conclude by raising the question, what would Jesus do? From his sermon series, he wrote a book, which was read 103 years later in 1989 by a youth minister named Jamie Tinkelberg, who fell in love with the phrase and had it inscribed on friendship bracelets for the youth at her church. It took off from there and has become a part of modern culture. A quick way to raise for ourselves the moral, theological, and ethical questions whenever we take Scripture seriously, and particularly when faced with challenge and trouble, issues of right and wrong, issues of justice and oppression, and issues of life and death. So what would Jesus do about George Floyd's death as one in a succession of high-profile murders of African Americans, stretching from the lynching trees of slavery to Emmett Till, to Trayvon Martin, to Eric Garner, to Ahmaud Arbery, to Breonna Taylor, just to name a few? What would Jesus do about these murders happening in the middle of a global pandemic and economic meltdown that were already disproportionately impacting Black and brown people? What would Jesus say about the virus that attacks our bodies, the brutality of white violence that attacks our souls and bodies, and the system of judicial and economic victimization that disproportionately destroys our lives? Sadly, even in the middle of a pandemic, we are still the strange fruit that hangs from the poisoned tree of America that is racist down to its roots. WWJD, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? And most importantly, what would Jesus have us to do and to say? It is important that we base our answer from the Jesus of Scripture rather than the Jesus scripted by our current culture of political correctness. Because the Jesus of the Bible pushes us past our comfort zones and causes us to confront the hypocrisies within ourselves that we often choose not to face. According to the sacred text, I believe Jesus would do at least three things. I believe Jesus would pray, I believe Jesus would engage, and I believe that Jesus would act. One bedrock kingdom principle of the teaching ministry of Jesus was the sacrificial nature of being a disciple. Jesus declared those who seek to save their lives will lose it, but those who lose their lives for my sake will find it. Jesus' Beatitudes extol meekness, being pure in heart, righteousness, and being peacemakers, amongst others. Jesus states clearly that when we are struck, we are called to turn the other cheek and exercise inexhaustible forgiveness as he admonished to forgive 70 times 7. Yet Jesus also practiced a more radical ministry of opposition to the status quo, forcefully confronting and openly rebuking the religious leaders of his time and upending their understanding of the law. Jesus demonstrated a deep allegiance to those who were oppressed by sickness or circumstance and commanded that we provide food and clothing and shelter to those in need. Yet there is a sharp pebble in the slipper of those who would simply label Jesus as a pacifist. This scriptural pebble, attested by all four gospel writers, who each describe how Jesus acted in a way that was at least riotous. Each gospel writer portrays Jesus through their own lens, doing the same thing. Jesus entered the temple. Jesus made a whip and chased away those who were engaged in the trade of money. Jesus turned over the tables and the chairs, and Jesus declared, "My Father's house shall be called a house of prayer for all people, but you have made it a den of robbers." And like so many things in life, it is not enough to know what was done. We must also understand what motivated the behavior. Thankfully, We do not need to speculate, for the gospel text provides sufficient explanatory information. Number one, Jesus complains that God's house lacks the reverence and prayer, now bearing more resemblance to the common market than a place sanctified for the worship of the maker of heaven and earth. Number two, he also complains that there are persons who are using the court of the Gentiles, a designated space dedicated for those Gentile proselytes who had come to worship Yahweh. He is offended equally of this unjust treatment of these people based on their ethnicity. Finally, in his complaint, he states, in the affirmative, which is a combination of the first two, when he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people," he is stating that its market culture has taken away from the purpose of prayer, and that the house of prayer is not to be a place of oppression, but rather it's to be open for all. Jesus saw unrighteousness in the house of God, and it deeply offended him. He also saw discrimination, and it set him off. As a consequence, he forcefully engaged those who were there to make things right. Jesus did not call us to take up arms against oppression. He did not call us to destroy properties or to take lives to achieve our socioeconomic freedom, but he did call us to act. He did call us to engage. He did call us to pray. He did call us to resist. He did call us to demonstrate our faith in sacrificial ways. He did call us to trust in his name and the power of his kingdom. So since armed conflict is not the way of the kingdom, then what would God have me to do? I believe God would have all of us to trust him, to speak truth unflinchingly, knowing that if I speak, he'll stand, and never back away from the advocating for the least, the lost, and the left out. Therefore, I want to issue this call to arms and this call to action. Number one, pray. If Jesus declares that my house shall be called the house of prayer for all people, then as the people of God, we must allow prayer and its resultant power to define us. So pray. Pray for the nation. Pray for all governmental leaders. Pray for those who properly seek to protect and serve. Pray for those who protest, that they may be filled with righteous anger, but not sin. Pray for the family of George Floyd and all others who have likewise fallen victim to white rage dressed in blue uniforms. Number two, engage. Engage in courageous conversations with those in your personal sphere of influence. Speak to colleagues and co-workers, classmates, and civic leaders. You need not be confrontational, but you cannot be afraid because of the fear of confrontation. There are those who say they believe in equality around you, but are deafeningly silent when injustice occurs. You will help them to find their voice after you find yours. So you need to pray. I want you to engage. But thirdly, we need to act. A group of 100 ministers from around the nation and I participated in a call on yesterday, led by CNN's Van Jones, the Reverend Al Sharpton, and Bishop T.D. Jakes. We are partnering with Color of Change. We are encouraging you to text the word demands to 55156 to learn about more action steps that you can take to affect the issue of police brutality at the systemic level. And text the word Floyd to 55156 to get updates on the case of Mr. George Floyd and action steps that you may take to ensure that his murderers are held to account. My name is Matthew Watley, and I endorse this message.